diving in here into the panic meter headed into week 7. This is a segment that we do on a weekly basis. We rate teams based off of how nervous their fans should be following a loss in the previous week. 1 being no worries whatsoever, they are sitting comfortably, and 10 being hitting the panic button and having to make a drastic change. So the first team, as we always do, the loser of Monday Night Football. This week it was the New York Jets, who lost, but I do still feel better about them headed into last week as opposed to this prior week, where obviously the Davante Adams trade changes a whole lot of things in this as a whole, considering the fact that I do think that their roster as a whole just got better in this past week, which is definitely something that the Jets should be feeling optimistic about internally. Obviously, a loss is a loss, and it's hard to come away with too many moral victories, but last week I had them at an 8 coming off of what was a much uglier loss, in my opinion, to the Vikings in London. At least this past week they showed some optimism of an offense, and there are going to still be steps that need to be taken, and I still don't think that the addition of Davante Adams necessarily fixes everything. That offensive line has not done a good enough job protecting Aaron Rodgers. I am somebody who is a little bit more on the optimistic side about what this O-line can eventually provide. They've had a little bit of instability, specifically at that right tackle spot where it was Morgan Moses dealing with an injury that he was missed the past couple of weeks. Olu Fashanu was taking over in that time. 3 new offensive linemen to start this year, and I think overall a talented group. So I do feel like the Jets can improve offensively as they move on from here. I think there are holes still on both sides of the roster. This is not a team that I consider to be a true Super Bowl contender, but now it at least feels like the Jets are headed in a more positive direction and they can make a real play at the playoffs despite a 2-4 start. So I have the Jets a little bit more on the concern side. Last week I had them at an 8. This week they actually improve a little bit. Even despite the loss, I have them at a 7. Next up, the worst loss of the weekend was the Dallas Cowboys, who got absolutely pummeled by the Detroit Lions in the mid-afternoon slate on Sunday. And this was a bloodbath really from the start, which is something that I don't think was entirely unexpected, but still, to the degree that this happened, has to feel terrible from a team standpoint, the organization up top, the fans, all of it. It was a bit of a disaster. And again, this is not a scenario where I feel like this came out of nowhere, where we knew very clearly, and the reason why we were on the Lions last week, it was because of the fact that there is such a blatant mismatch in the Lions running game against that Cowboys front 7, and it very clearly won out. It's just that the Cowboys weren't able to find any sort of other, realm of optimism in this game either. And the Cowboys, I have them at a 7, similar to the Jets. Now, these two teams, I do feel, I would say, better about the Jets as a team as a whole. But the bright side for the Cowboys is that their division is still very much in reach, where it's the Commanders and the Eagles ahead of them right now. I think that both of those teams are probably better than Dallas is, but I also think that it is pretty possible that I think that every one of those teams has flaws. It's not like there is a clear-cut winner of that division in the NFC East in front of us, and we're going to be talking about the Commanders here in a moment, but I think that the Cowboys, they have a lot of areas that they need to improve. Now, some of those will be aided by getting some players back from injury. Brandon Cooks on offense, some key members of their defense, Micah Parsons, Deron Bland, DeMarcus Lawrence. They can all help make the Cowboys a better team. I don't know if it makes them a playoff team, though. So I am pretty sufficiently concerned about the Cowboys. I have them sitting at a 7. Like I mentioned, Washington Commanders in the NFC in the NFC East, I have them at a 3 coming into week 7. And the idea behind this is that, this is a team that it is so hard to be panicked about who they are at this current point in time, because they were maybe by some people seen as a dark horse coming into this season. I wasn't on the Commanders like that headed into this year, so they've been a very fun surprise from an NFL viewership standpoint. And I think that ultimately for the Commanders in all of this, they are in a position where they can, understand that they're kind of playing with house money to some degree. This has been a very successful season already up to this point. And I think that they are still legitimately in contention for being a top 10 team in the NFL. Now, with those sort of new updated expectations for the Commanders, there are definitely holes in this roster, and it is basically up and down that defense, which is where I have the issues. The Ravens were able to just have their way with this Commanders defense, ultimately allowed over 400 total yards. They got dominated in both the passing and running game this past weekend. I do think that their secondary is a genuine concern as a whole. And for their front seven to be ran on like they did, it was 484 yards allowed total, 308 passing, 176 on the ground. So the Commanders, there's no panic for the most part in terms of, what the direction of this team is moving forward. But in terms of this season and being now a playoff contender, I do think that there are issues with the roster. I mentioned the defense, and again, that secondary, which they have to go out, and even if it's a middling cornerback, I saw a mock trade for Jonathan Jones of the Patriots. Like, even something like that, I think would be worthwhile for the Commanders to invest a little bit more into their secondary here. But the other part of it as well is that the offense, I don't think that there really are all that many. I think they're missing a second option is really what I'm getting at here, where Terry McLaurin, obviously, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, borderline top 10 there. He is continuing to have a very good year. He had 2 touchdowns this past weekend against the Ravens. Zach Ertz has shown a little bit of life these past couple weeks, but, overall, it's a lot more sort of just gadget guys that take turns having big moments. Zacchaeus has had some good games for them as well. We see Ertz and Noah Brown a little bit involved as well. But they are missing that wide receiver too, which has been clear since preseason, since they traded Jahan Dotson. I would definitely prefer for them to have a second weapon, which eventually when we get into some of these more high leverage games down the stretch of the year, you think about how opposing defenses are going to play Terry McLaurin and trying to remove him. How will Jaden Daniels be able to succeed? We'll see. I still think he will be able to do a good job, but difficult situation there to sort of navigate through as a rookie quarterback. But the Arizona Cardinals, a team that I was very high on coming into this season, and I guess it really is just on me in terms of picking this team to be the dark horse playoff contender, but they have looked very far from that up to this point in the season, where, they have a couple valuable wins against divisional opponents, blowing out the Rams in week 2 and coming back against the 49ers just last week, to the point where the Cardinals are a team that, they're still not out of it entirely, but my concerns with them sort of lie in 2 of the most important spots, and that is, at least to some degree, Kyler Murray at quarterback and with Jonathan Gannon as the head coach, where it's not like either one of them should be losing their jobs up to this point in the year. Because, again, for the most part, expectations were pretty low for Arizona. I was high on them, but that's just sort of me internally. They knew this was going to be a little bit of, not quite a rebuild, but, definitely at least a retooling. And I think it's been kind of concerning what we've seen from Kyler Murray up to this point. And not to the point where, again, he's been a disaster. Do I love the contract? No, not necessarily, but it's definitely not a top 3, probably not a top 5 worst quarterback contract in the NFL. So, there are flaws there, sure, but it's something that they can put a competent team around him and be competitive. And the Cardinals have shown an ability to be competitive even in a number of these losses. This past weekend against the Packers was not that. They were dominated on both sides of the ball, and I am, again, given my expectations preseason for them that they could be a dark horse playoff team, I'm definitely disappointed there. But the panic level as a whole, I think it probably sits around a 7, which is where I have them at this current point, considering the fact that this season seems like it might be getting away from them. Still early in the year, and it's still very possible for them to work their way back into it. But truthfully, I don't think that there is any chance within reason, barring anything crazy happening, that they overtake the 49ers to win their division. So then they're competing with a number of these teams for the wild card spot. And you look at the NFC, feels like it's dominated by that NFC North division at this point. The Packers, the Lions, the Vikings, the Bears. I think that they get a division winner and at least 2 wild card teams in there. And everybody else is just sort of duking it out for that 7 seed, or at least that 7th spot. Seeding itself is sort of a different conversation there. And it's possible for the Cardinals, but at this point, I'm not very confident in them to be able to pull it off, so I have them at a 7. The Seattle Seahawks, one of their divisional rivals. Seahawks, a little bit in a similar situation, I suppose. They're a step behind in terms of the divisional race. The 49ers did beat them. That's something that the Cardinals do have over the 49ers and over the Seahawks, I suppose, to some degree as well. But the difference is the Seahawks have reinforcements coming. They've been dealing with a number of injuries, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that I do think once they get more of their playmakers, specifically in that front 7, back from injury, that they can sort of start to take this thing back to the next level. Now, the Seahawks, they have some blatant flaws, and specifically it's the offensive line and the lack of production from there. The defense hasn't been very good. You could frankly say they've been bad the past 3 weeks during this losing streak. And the times that they've looked good, they have beaten Bo Nix in his first career start and 2 quarterbacks that are no longer starting quarterbacks in the NFL just a few weeks later. So that is something to definitely take into consideration with the Seahawks team. I was thinking of having them at a 6. I ultimately bumped them down to a 5 because ultimately when you're talking about panic, I mean, the Seahawks kind of, they've won the games they should have up to this point in the year, and I don't think that any one of these games, I suppose the Giants loss is definitely a bad one, but for the most part, the Seahawks aren't far off of what their preseason expectations are, and they have a chance to be better should they get healthy. So I'm in the middle with them. I have them at a 5. I think it's very possible that they do put together a run for the playoffs, but they're going to need to be better defensively, or be better more so offensively on that line of scrimmage, get Kenneth Walker more involved, and then hope that once they get healthier on defense, they can, play like a top 10 group, which a lot of people had them as coming into this season. And then final team here, the Denver Broncos. I think the Broncos are pretty all right, all things considered. They're 3-3 right now. They are definitely in contention for a wild card spot. It's hard to panic right now and at all for the Broncos, considering that they're starting a rookie quarterback right now. Do I think the Bo Nix is the most talented quarterback, especially first-round quarterback that we've seen drafted in recent years? No. But he's shown signs of promise. I thought he was pretty good in that Raiders win week 5. Last week, it was a really slow start for the Broncos that they couldn't overcome, but you saw some flashes from Nix in the second half to make that game a little bit more competitive. And I think that just seeing, signs of improvement from Bo Nix ultimately is where this franchise should be at. Now, pressure's amped up a little bit more because that defense has been so excellent to begin the year that now there are a little bit more expectations with the Broncos. And under Sean Payton, you do kind of think that you have a shot at being competitive anytime you have a Hall of Fame caliber coach on your sideline for you. So, as of right now, still a very early season. I think that this offense could continue to come a long way. I have them at a 4 right now. I am less worried about them than I am worried. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section, as we are going to be taking a quick break. And when we come back on the other side, I want to talk about the Green Bay Packers a little bit more closely and talking about where they currently stand in the NFL after a dominant win over the Arizona Cardinals. So we're going to be diving into that. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.